Pigs are demonstrably smarter than dogs, and there's no disrespect to dogs. I have a dog, we love dogs, but pigs are smarter than dogs. And there are billions, with a B, billions of animals living in factory farming conditions. Most egg-laying hens live their entire lives in what's called a battery cage, which is a cage about the size of a file cabinet drawer. Think about opening your filing cabinet up and there's 4 hens living their entire lives in there. They never move.
But you recently made a sort of heretical statement, which is saying that there's a place for meat eaters in the animal welfare movement.
I say this as somebody who's been a vegan for almost 30 years myself.
What labels on food actually matter for animal welfare?
All natural, farm fresh, these are marketing terms. They mean nothing, right? You can't get 80% of American voters to agree on anything.
No.
And yet they agree that we need much stronger animal welfare laws in this country. You have more power than you realize.
All right, Dan, well, you run the Humane League. It's one of the largest, arguably most effective animal welfare organizations in the world. And I would say generally animal welfare organizations have, sort of steered people into don't eat meat, go vegan. But you recently made a sort of heretical statement, which is saying that there's a place for meat eaters in the animal welfare movement. Now, before we get into why you said that in your point, I want to sort of set the stage for people about animal welfare. I think we all sort of inherently know factory farming is bad, but what are the realities of what you're fighting for here? What does that actually mean, and what happens in factory farming?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what you said. I think most people have some sense that factory farming is not good for animals. It's not good for the planet. It's not good for the people involved. What I don't think people have is a good understanding about a couple things. I think one is the scale that factory farming operates at. Just in this country, in the US alone, at any given time, there are billions, with a B, billions of animals living in factory farming conditions. We can talk more about what those conditions look like. But that's at any given time, the farmed animal population of this planet far exceeds the human population, and by several times. So if you just think about the scale of the individuals involved, I think people often just aren't quite connecting with that piece of it, right? And how much that's grown significantly over the past 50, 75 years, even from when our grandparents were around. Another thing that I think people don't really understand is the kind of depth of the suffering, right? Of the kind of how bad the welfare conditions are for animals in industrialized agriculture. I think a lot of us grew up with the Richard Scarry type of books, right? Where it's kind of like you've got happy animals, grassy fields. It's not to say that doesn't exist, right? In some parts of this country, you can drive through on the highway and you might see cows kind of out on a grassy field and think that seems fine, right? But those conditions represent, less than 3%, 2%, right, of the overall volume of animals that are living in agriculture at any given time. And for 97-ish% of animals, the reality is very different from that.
So we're talking billions that are living in this different reality, which we're about to get into.
Yeah, exactly that. And you go to the farmer's market and you talk to the very nice farmer there. They're probably doing a great job, right? And they're taking animal welfare very seriously. But again, they make up a tiny fraction of the overall industry. And what the reality is for the majority of the industry and the majority of the animals involved is an industrialized approach to agriculture. And that means a couple of things. It means treating animals more like, farm equipment, right? Like a tractor, right? Than you would a dog or a cat, right? And so that manifests in some different ways. It manifests primarily through extreme confinement conditions, right? Housing animals in the smallest space that's economically viable to save money. Right. You save money that way by, overall operation costs, by the amount of feed that these animals eat, because if they can't move around, right, they don't burn a lot of calories. So they don't need a lot of feed. And there's multiple ways that becomes economical for the industry. But what that means for the animals, right, and to give one example, is like in the egg industry, which we do a lot of work on at the Humane League, most egg-laying hens live their entire lives in what's called a battery cage, which is a cage about the size of a file cabinet drawer. Where you'd see 4 to 6 animals living their entire lives from birth to death, never setting foot outside of that.
In a filing
cabinet. I
encourage
people just
4 to 6.
Yeah,
Holy
exactly.
Crap.
Just think about opening your filing cabinet up and there's 4 hens living their entire lives in there. They never move, right? animals aren't allowed, they're not able to spread their wings, they're not able to move around, right? So there's the obvious like physical, right, conditions and the suffering that creates. There's also a sort of, a kind of mental toll that this takes on the animals, who have rich inner lives, the same as our cats and dogs do, right? And then chickens, to continue that example, these are animals whose natural instincts tell them to nest, right? To build nests, to dust bathe, to perch, right? And these, might seem silly to us because we don't have those instincts, but for them, these are like very deeply rooted instinctual behaviors that they have. And there's a tremendous amount of mental suffering that goes into having all those behaviors frustrated, right? And they're not able to pursue them in the conditions that they live in. Then the third thing that I would point to is the kind of social dynamics for these animals, right? Like we are, right? Animals are inherently social, right? And they don't, the farming environments don't recreate the same kinds of social structures, right? Familial interactions that animals would have. In most instances, when pregnant farmed animals give birth, the babies are separated from the mothers at the moment of birth, never to see them again, right? And so in all these different ways, their inherent social structures are broken apart. And again, a tremendous amount of stress and suffering comes with that. And just basically, these animals' lives don't look anything like what they would look like in the wild or even a close proximity to that. When you think about the billions and billions of animals that are living in those conditions every day of their lives, every day of our lives, right? The scale of this issue, I really truly believe, is a moral atrocity of historic proportions, right? And I firmly believe that there will come a time in the future where we'll look back on this period of animal agriculture and see it as, I think, what a lot of us see it as today, which was a kind of historical mistake, right? And a moral failure on our part to kind of recognize that this is what we were doing and doing something about it. We're not there yet, obviously, but I think our work at the Humane League and across the animal protection movement is to try to bring that moment about and try to accelerate our progress.
Yeah. I think some people have a point of view of, well, they're animals, we're humans, they're different, they don't suffer like us. What do we know about animals' ability to suffer mentally and physically? And then how does that actually manifest itself based on what either scientists or people with organizations like yours see in some of these factory farms?
Yeah, so we do know that animals can, scientifically proven to feel pain and suffer basically the same way that we do, particularly factory, farmed animals, cows, chickens, pigs, central nervous system, right, cerebral cortex. They have all the wiring, right, that they need to feel pain and suffer the same way that we do, the same way that cats and dogs do. Um, Farmed animals are more intelligent, I think, than people give them credit for, right? When you start thinking about the mental anguish, pigs are demonstrably smarter than dogs. And there's no disrespect to dogs. I have a dog. We love dogs, but pigs are smarter than dogs, right? And so I often think about dogs as our analogy for just like, imagine your dog living in these types of conditions and what that would mean to them. And it's going to be no different from a pig, right? I do think it's fair to say that animals are different from humans, right? So a lot of people don't realize that pigs, right, are proven to be as intelligent as dogs. They perform just as high as dogs do on animal kind of cognition and intelligence tests. So I often think about dogs as our analogy, right? Imagine your family dog at home living through the kinds of conditions that we talked about, and that's kind of what's happening. I do think it's fair, right, to acknowledge that animals and humans are different, right? We are not exactly the same, but that doesn't mean that the ways that we are the same, right, don't need to be taken seriously, right? Nobody's advocating for animals to like have the right to vote, right? Because animals don't need the right to vote. That's not a relevant need to them, right? But their need to not suffer, right? Their need to live in an environment that is natural to them, their need to be with their families and their innate desire to be with like those things are all very much the same, right? And so I often think it's really about thinking about what would we do to a dog or a cat that lives in our home? And do we feel comfortable, right, with that same an animal with that same ability to feel pain and suffer, that same ability to kind of experience it, living in the kind of conditions we talked about. I think most people would agree that.
Yeah. So now to pivot to so you recently took this role as CEO of the Humane League. I think this was about a year and a half ago. And part of your message is that you think there is room for meat eaters in the animal welfare movement, which I think when I heard that, it surprised me. It's like, oh, that's interesting. So unpack that. What is your thinking behind that? and then we'll get into how that was received. But first, tell us why that's your position.
Yeah, I think I don't see. I'll be even more direct. I don't really see a path to the future that I described. Right, one where we look back and say, "Oh wow, factory farming was really a kind of dark period in our history." I don't see any path to getting there without the support, right, and the enthusiastic participation of people who eat meat or eat animal products, right, who aren't vegetarian or vegan. I say this as somebody who's been a vegan for almost 30 years myself, right? So I think that's a great choice for people to make if they're concerned about animal suffering, but I don't think it's the only choice. And I often think that I think factory farming is the result of a set of individual policy, like corporate and public policy decisions that have been made along the way. It is not this force of nature. It is not this kind of incontrovertible truth about the man's relation or humanity's relationship to animals. It's a choice that we've made. It's a result of a set of choices that we've made. And to get out of it, we just need to make a set of different choices, right? As it comes to corporate policy, right? The way companies manage their food supply chain, and public policy, right? And laws and regulations that govern the way that animals are raised for food and other things like farm subsidies. And we can get into all the details.
All right. So all that said, what was the reaction you got from the animal welfare movement when you took that position?
Yeah, I think historically this is not a popular position in the animal protection movement, or at least in a certain wing of the animal protection movement. But I think more and more, my experience is that I think the movement is coming to terms with the idea that I'm sharing here, which is that we have to build a broader tent of people who care about animals if we're going to be effective at achieving our kind of big picture objectives in the long term. Again, I mentioned I'm somebody who happens to have been vegan for a long time, but that's like 1% of us, 1.5% of us, right? And in order to fundamentally reform and ultimately end factory farming, which is our goal at the Humane League, we're going to need a broad movement of public support to do that. And I don't think movements that are measured in the 1%, 2%, 3% of people are, ultimately sufficient at being able to achieve those kinds of big structural change type of objectives. So I find that more and more people are embracing that idea. And I think I've been a part of a lot of conversations recently across the movement about what does it actually look like to implement that? Like, how do we think about messaging? How do we think about outreach? How do we think about programs and campaigns, that create more of that kind of welcoming environment and invite people, right, who don't identify as vegetarian or vegans into the movement. And I think I expect to be seeing a lot more of that kind of activity happening.
Yeah. What are those initial sort of outreaches and messaging? What do those look like? And what's been the reaction?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people, as you framed the conversation this way, the story they've heard is factory farming is bad for animals. Basically, it's your fault, right? Because of the personal dietary choices that you make, and the responsibility is on you to change it. I don't, is there a small amount of truth to that story? Sure. But I don't think it's the full truth or the kind of real truth, right? The real truth is that factory farming, even for people who eat meat, eat animal products, this isn't something that anybody asked for, right? These are a set of decisions that were made by people in positions of power and influence, at corporations and the government, right, that have brought us to this place. And I think people have a tremendous amount of power, right, more than we realize, to influence those decision makers, right, those companies, governments, state and local legislatures, et cetera, to make different choices, right? And it will take a lot of different choices over a long period of time to kind of back out of the factory farming industry that we've put ourselves into, but it can be done, right? And I think it's really about asking people to flex their citizen power, right? Their ability to make phone calls to members of Congress and legislators, right? To talk to the companies that they might shop for about wanting to see higher welfare standards and options at the grocery stores and in restaurants, right? Acting as citizens, right? I think the way many of us are used to acting on other issues that we might care about, whether it's climate or public health or other things, and not only ask people to flex their consumer power, right? Sort of what do they choose to buy? What do they choose to eat?
Yeah, and I think to your point that no one made the decision for us, it really did just come down to a mathematical equation of saving money. Now, to your point about how animals are treated as farm equipment, if you're talking about farm equipment and how to make that more efficient, great. We're talking about pieces of steel and oil and all these things. But when we're talking about sentient beings, that becomes really problematic to put something like that into a math equation. I think, too, when the request is made for people to go from, say, standard American diet to vegan, it's kind of like asking someone to go from A to Z, not A to B to C to D. So what in your mind are some of the first steps someone can take to get to B so they can then go to C and then D and then see how far down the alphabet line they can go?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of our work at the Humane League is about sort of mobilizing citizen power to influence institutional decision making. And I think there's a lot of early steps that people can take, whether it's with our organization or somebody else, right, in that vein. We do a lot of work in other organizations across the movement to get companies to improve animal welfare in their supply chain, right? As an example, we're trying to get Kroger right now, one of the largest grocery companies in the country, to go fully cage free with their egg supply, right? To kind of no longer buy eggs and sell eggs from farms that look like what I described previously, and buy them from cage free farms that, we should be clear, are also still not great for animals, but a significant improvement, right, on the kind of traditional battery cage system that we described. So people can call a company like Kroger and ask them what their cage-free policy is. And if it's not, 100% cage-free sourcing, ask them why not, and what they can do about it. If they shop at a local Kroger, right, they could maybe choose to take their business elsewhere, or at least talk to the manager at the store, right, kind of make their voice heard. There's also a lot of work being done to protect farmed animals at the public policy level. So right now, as some of your audience may be familiar, there's a big debate in Congress over the next draft of the Farm Bill, right? And whether or not it will include language that would overturn a set of state-level animal welfare laws in states like California and Massachusetts that have passed laws that actually ban a lot of the kind of extreme confinement systems that we talked about earlier. So like very strong, very good, very powerful laws. The industry doesn't like these laws for obvious reasons, and so their lobbyists in Congress are trying to push to kill them. And there's a language in the House's draft of the Farm Bill that would essentially overturn a set of state-level laws that were passed democratically, right? Either through ballot measures, where the bill in California, Proposition 12, passed with a 25% margin, right? Like it was like 75 to something, I forget. Massive popular support for laws like this across the country. So not only is it bad for animals, it's fundamentally undemocratic, right? For the federal government to say, we don't like your state laws, we're going to overturn them. So, right, that's an example where people can make a phone call to their member of Congress or to their senator and say, how are you planning to vote on this bill, right? Please don't vote on any bill that would strip animal welfare protections at the state level. That's just one example of a policy ask. Here in New York, right, in New York City, where I live, we have a ban on foie gras in the city, which is a product that's produced using very cruel methods that I won't get into because they're too unpleasant to talk about. So there's a lot of public policy opportunities for people to think about using their voting power, right, to support candidates that have a good position on farm animal welfare and speak out against individual bills that would be bad for animals or in favor of ones.
Yeah, that makes sense. To kind of give you an anecdote at the personal level with me, I mean, I was one of those people, like I think every single American is, where you know that factory farming is bad, but you're like, you just kind of, you fall into it anyways, and you don't think about it all that often. Then I read Animal Liberation Now by Peter Singer. He's a philosopher at Princeton. Really, I would argue, kind of started the movement. So I read this book. It was the updated edition of his book. I was like, oh my God, I had no idea how bad it is on so many levels. And so I went vegan. I wrote it out for a while, but then eventually, because I travel so much for work and I'm always on the move, I found it really, really difficult. I'd be in an airport and I'd be like, I don't think there's anything for me to eat here beyond trail mix. So what I started to do is pivot into having some animal products in my diet. But what I did is I looked for places where, do I need animal products here? So for example, at breakfast, if I'm using whey protein, it turns out that like all these companies now make amazing vegetable protein powders, and I can have an apple and some blueberries at lunch. If I was going to eat X meat, it's like, you know what? I also really enjoy air fried tofu. So now I'm going to swap that out. Now at dinner, I might sometimes have meat, but for me, it was like this kind of big picture look and go, where don't I need these products? And also kind of giving myself permission to not feel like a terrible killer. If I get in a position where it's like, okay, our option is an animal product now, but you've done all this other work to remove animal products from your diet. And I think that's a win. And then the other thing I did is I started giving money to the Humane League which leads me into a point that you made. I believe I heard you say, you being a vegan for 30 years, you've probably impacted the lives of thousands of animals. But if you as an organization can get a massive corporation like Kroger or a fast food place to change their policies, now we're talking in the millions of animals that you can affect. So talk to me, you mentioned the Kroger campaign. What else are you thinking about right now in terms of getting some of these big food corporations to shift? And what do you think the outcome of that will be?
Yeah, it's a great point. To your point, it's just why our theory of change is centered on institutional decision making, because none of us have the ability to make those kinds of decisions that are going to affect millions, unless we happen to be the Kroger CEO or something, right? And if you're listening, you know what you need to do. So the way we think about it is this: our focus, as I mentioned, is right now is on moving the industry away from these battery cages to cage free. We do that for a couple of reasons. We think it's because that is where the highest sort of degree of suffering is taking place, and also where we think it's the most tractable, it's the most movable, right? Because there are just very clear alternatives that nearly half, right, of the industry has already adopted at this point, right? So in the U.S., we are at about 50% of the egg industry has moved to cage-free production methods, right? So there's no practical, there's no technical, there's no operational reason why any company can't choose to go 100% cage-free. It's really just a matter of will and being willing to make the decision. Of those 50% that are of the industry that is still reliant on battery cages, most of that is supply to the grocery industry, because as you could guess, most eggs that are bought in the United States are bought in grocery stores. So that is why our focus is on the grocery industry right now, and really kind of moving individual big players in the grocery industry to cage free. We recently had a great victory at the Humane League, and several other organizations across the movement all worked together on this to get Ahold Delhaize, which is probably a name that doesn't mean anything to anybody, but it's a holding company. They own Stop and Shop, Food Lion, Hannaford, a bunch of East Coast grocery chains that people probably know. They did exactly what we're asking Kroger to do, which is they made a commitment to go 100% cage free. It takes some time, right? It'll take them some years to kind of implement it. That's fine. That's normal. So we've got Ahold Delhaize now, which I think is the fifth largest grocery company. Kroger would be the fourth, right? And there's only a couple of companies left after that. The biggest one being Walmart, of course, right? Which is the biggest. They're the biggest everything of everything, but they're the biggest purchaser of eggs worldwide in the U.S. But if we can get just a handful of additional companies, right, to commit to going cage free in their supply chain, the entire industry will move. And I think it's entirely possible within the next, let's say 5 to 10 years, that there will not be battery cages for egg-laying hens in this country. They'll still exist in other parts of the world, but that would be a massive turning point. And we focus on that for two reasons. One is the reason I said we just think it's where the highest welfare gains are to be had, but it also becomes a proof point, right? Because if the egg industry can fully transition to higher welfare methods, well, so can the pork producing industry, and so can the what they call broiler chickens, the meat producing chickens. And so I think if we have that kind of industry case study of a full transition to higher welfare, we can accelerate the progress that we're trying to make on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like animal welfare used to sort of be viewed as more of a left-leaning cause, I would say. But I feel like it's starting to really cross political lines. And as you mentioned with that voting, what are you seeing out there? Do you feel like we've hit a moment where now it's just sort of a lot more people from all different backgrounds are asking questions about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's a relatively unique issue in American public life that hasn't been sort of fully polarized in one direction or the other. I mentioned the Farm Bill debate that's taking place right now. Some of our strongest allies in Congress have been on the Republican side of the aisle, and we've had strong allies on the Democrat side as well. Actually, it was one of the representatives, Representative Luna Costa, who's a Republican from Florida, I believe, was one of the leading advocates against this kind of language that we talked about that would overturn state-level welfare laws. So I do think there's no necessarily sort of political ideology that maps to caring about farm animals or not. And if you look at the public, it's the same, right? I mentioned Proposition 12 in California. It's the strongest state level animal welfare law in the country. It bans the production and the sale of animal products produced through extreme confinement in the state of California. So battery cages, like we talked about, crates for pigs, similar devices, veal crates, things like that. That law polls at 80% nationwide.
Wow.
Right. So if you ask voters, would you like to have a law like this in your state? 80% of voters say yes. And it's not meaningfully different based on party affiliation. You can't get 80% of American voters to agree on anything.
No.
And yet they agree that we need much stronger animal welfare laws in this country. So I have a lot of hope for the future of public policy and kind of legislation and regulation around the movement. I think it's just a matter of us as a movement investing ourselves in bringing that about. So I think the political will and the public support is there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk about how to actually eat. What labels on food actually matter for animal welfare? If I'm at the grocery store and I see all these different language on food, what should I actually be looking for?
It's a great question because this is, I think, where a lot of very well-meaning people get very tripped up. Yeah. And it's intentionally confusing, as you could guess, because the industry doesn't really want you to understand. So talking about continuing to use eggs as the example, right? Cage-free means something, right? It means rather than living in these battery cages that I described, hens live in, a shed environment, which again is not necessarily great for them. You wouldn't want to be a hen living in a cage-free facility, but it's significantly better than living in cage-free. Pasture raised would then be a step further than that. It's what it sounds like, right? Animals would have access to pasture, not necessarily live their entire lives on pasture. We should be clear to that, but have access to pasture. You then will see labels like, you go to you'd see, Farmer Brown's all natural farm fresh eggs, all natural farm fresh. These are marketing terms. They mean nothing, right? For animal welfare or for anything else.
Yeah.
And then what's interesting about organic label, which don't get me wrong, I support people buying organic. We try to buy organic things in our household, but organic doesn't necessarily mean higher welfare standards, right? Organic is focused on, it's things like pesticide use and important things that I at least think are important as well, but it doesn't necessarily correlate to animal welfare. So you're looking for, so pasture raised would be an indication that something is, there's a meaningful distinction between the standard practices and what this particular farm is.
Yeah, that makes sense. As a vegan, what is your take on ranchers and people who are trying to do the right thing, and how do people even find those products?
Yeah, a thing that I think people also don't realize about the agriculture industry is how consolidated it's become and how corporate it's become, like most other industries in the country, right? The majority of factory farms are operated by a very small number of companies, right? And like anything else, it's this highly consolidated, highly corporatized industry. One of the interesting things that we find is that some of the strongest supporters of farm animal welfare laws and some of the strongest opponents of the Farm Bill that would overturn these laws are small family farmers, right?
Wow.
Who do genuinely want to do the right thing, right? Are inherently at a competitive disadvantage to the big industrialized conglomerate mega corporations that dominate agriculture. And, despite I think they genuinely do want to do the right thing for animals because they live with these animals, they see them every day, right? I think they have a relationship with them and it's very different than a corporate approach. But also they see it as a competitive advantage, right? It's going to be probably easier for them as a smaller producer to transition to higher welfare standards. And so it gives them a competitive advantage against the industry to be able to kind of move in that direction. I think a lot of those producers are going to be local, right? So like when you go to your local farmer's market, right, you can ask questions to those producers about, how do your hens live? Did they live in cages? Did they live in sheds? Do they have access to pasture? Right? That's probably going to be your best bet for finding kind of very high welfare products. But when it comes to eggs, right, like a lot of even the big companies have transitioned their supply chain to cage free. And so if you see that label at the grocery store, even if it is, at a big, mega grocery retailer, like, you can understand that does mean something meaningful.
Yeah. Does the word free range mean, is that useful or is that?
Yeah, free range would be sort of equivalent to pasture raised, right? The idea that they're going to be out there and, have some amount of access to outdoors. Right, because again, the majority of animals just would never see the light of day outside of a factory.
What do you think will happen to pricing, because I think there's this, case you can also vote with your wallet. At the same time, if I buy, free range meat we get from a guy up in Idaho, and I got to meet him at the parking lot of a Walmart once every 3 months, and it's also a lot more expensive. Do you think economics will kind of play a role where the price of free range products will drop, or will those stay elevated? And what's your thoughts on that, given that people have only so much money for food and it's also increasing across the board?
Absolutely. Yeah. So to your point, free range would be sort of towards the top of the top of the scale in terms of high welfare. And the reality is, yes, it's going to be more expensive to produce that because you can't, as you talked about, like rely on that sort of, we're going to view these animals as production units and maximize for efficiency. It's just, there's a reason they do that. It helps them save money on production costs. So there is a certain reality to that. But I think a couple of things are true. I think for some of the incremental welfare improvements, right, like moving from battery cages to cage-free, that's an incremental step. There's not a massive production cost difference in that step, right? It's something, but it's like measured in like cents on a carton of eggs. What I find very interesting is when you go to the grocery store and you compare the price of the traditional eggs to cage-free eggs, you might see $1, $1.50, $2 markup on the package of cage-free eggs. Almost all of that is corporate margin. It's corporate profit.
Wow.
It's a sort of green tax or a humane tax, if you want to look at it that way, because companies have realized they can market that as a premium product, right? That there is a for people who can't afford it, which I agree with you, everybody can't. But for people who can afford it, they're prepared to pay more for higher welfare products. But people don't need to be paying the extra $1, $1.50. It should really just be a couple cents, right? So I think also part of it is about companies very cynically exploiting people's desire for higher welfare products to jack up the prices. I'm not suggesting that's what your guy in Idaho is doing. That's probably a real meaningful production cost. But I think for those incremental improvements, there's a lot of kind of corporate greed kind of sitting behind it and exploitation of consumers. I think if you take a very long view to like how the industry is going to evolve over time, right? If you think about what it's going to look like to fundamentally transform the animal agriculture ecosystem and start moving away from factory farming at scale, the reality is I do think it's going to require fewer animal products being produced, sold, and consumed.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's going to mean every single person needs to go 100% vegan, right? But it might mean that people need to think about moving from eating meat every day to maybe a couple of days a week, or every meal to one meal or two. Like incremental shifts in diet and also in just industrial use, right? To your point about corporate decisions, companies can do things like, I don't know, replace a egg ingredient in like a brownie, recipe that they produce at scale with a different product, and that can have a meaningful reduction in animal product production without anybody noticing. You know what I mean? So I do feel like that needs to be part of it. But I think about it as, and I think this is how it sounds like how you think about it. I identify as an environmentalist, a climate person, somebody who cares. Like I try to recycle. Do I recycle 100% of the bottles and cans that I get my hands on? No, probably not, right? If I'm out with my kid running around, I just might have to toss it in the trash, right? But recycling 90% or 80% of my bottling cans is 90 to 80% better than not doing it at all. And I think we need to look at animal consumption the same way, right? Incremental shift is what's needed. And if that's going to be accessible to people in a way that going vegetarian or vegan isn't, that's great, right? And that's got to be part of it. But I think the way the industry needs to evolve is the industry does need to shrink, right? We need to raise and fewer animals. And then I think that will help offset some of the kind of production costs, right? Because, and then I think it'll be easier for elements of the industry to transition to higher welfare standards while keeping costs more manageable for consumers.
Yeah. So how does the Humane League talk about this from a health perspective? And I'll give you my point of view. I think that you can do any diet really poorly. So we've kind of had a rise of, as veganism became more popular, we've had a rise of, well, now you can have vegan Doritos and vegan whatever. And in my mind, it all kind of comes down to the food sourcing, right? Like a vegan diet that is filled with the vegan version of junk food is probably going to be worse for you than a diet that is mostly whole foods but includes some animal products. I do think that if people were to shift to more plants, I think that would be really meaningful for public health, because when you look at the data, the vast majority of people are getting enough protein per day.
Absolutely.
but only 1 in 10 Americans eat enough fruits and vegetables every single day. So I think that needs to be the shift. How do you talk about that and think about health, or do you just stay out of it and focus on the ethics?
Yeah, as an organization, we're an animal welfare organization, so our messaging is focused on that. Just personally, I tend to agree with you, right? I don't necessarily identify as the most health forward vegan. Before I got on with you, I had my tofurkey sandwich with like vegan Takis. Do you know what I mean? Was
Awesome.
that like super healthy? Probably not, but I had a good time eating my lunch, and it's important that people enjoy their lives, right? I think that's got to be part of it. But yeah, to your point. The standard American diet, I don't think works well for anybody. It's just my personal opinion. Definitely doesn't work for animals. It doesn't work for our health. I think we've convinced ourselves, to your point, we have some kind of protein epidemic in this country that I don't think any of the data suggests. And then, you often hear, this is a bit adjacent to the health question, but to your point, right? Like people might try some vegan foods and not like it. I don't know how many people I've talked to is like, oh, I had a vegan burger and I didn't enjoy it. And it's like, well, I've had plenty of vegan burgers I didn't enjoy. Have you ever eaten a hamburger you didn't like? Some food is good, some food is bad. Some food is healthy, some food is unhealthy. And I think those are different kind of parameters than whether it's animal-based or not. I think it's important for people to just figure out what do they like to eat, right? And what is a plant-forward version of that diet that works for them and feels sustainable, right? Because I think that's the big thing. If people can make radical changes to their diet that aren't sustainable in the long term, and then they just go back to where they were previously. And I don't think that helps anybody, and it definitely doesn't help animals. So figuring out what's sustainable for you and what you enjoy eating in a way that kind of takes all these considerations into consideration, I think that's the path for most people.
Yeah, you've been a vegan for 30 years. What are some of the things that helped you the most at staying on the path in terms of how you approached eating and living in a world where, if you find yourself at the airport, your only choice is trail mix?
Yeah, I'm dating myself a little bit, but I went vegan when I was 17 years old. I didn't know how to cook. So like first of it was just like figuring out how to cook for myself, which hopefully most people don't need to go through that kind of one-on-one level version of it. But I also think it is about learning how to cook with different kinds of products. As a tangent, my wife is a vegan cookbook author, and a lot of what she writes about in her books is about, we have access to these products that sort of replace animal products in certain right? Like I've got, I can use a veggie burger as opposed to a hamburger, but they don't necessarily cook the same way, right? And so you might prepare a vegan burger a little differently than you would a meat burger, right? And so I think a lot of it is just about figuring out how to evolve also like your preparation, the types of meals that you make, and the way that you cook them and prepare them to account for different types of products. For a lot of people, right? Like I grew up in my dad cooked Italian food for us. So figuring out like, Italian food is what feels like comfort food to me. So what are kind of vegan versions of Italian comfort food that we can make at home? So I think for me, and also just the products have improved tremendously over the past 30 years. I remember having to drive, literally drive 2 towns over to get like a shelf stable carton of soy milk for my cereal in the morning, which I can now get at the bodega around the corner from my apartment in New York City. Every product's not going to be for everybody, and every meal isn't going to be for everybody. So I just think trying a bunch of things, seeing what works for you, and figuring out what your go-to is. Because I think the other people think about having a vegan lifestyle is like, oh, you're reading labels constantly, but it's just like, I don't know about you, I buy most of the same things in the grocery store every week. I don't need to read the labels. I already know what's in it, right? So sort of figuring out what's my go-to and how do I prepare it in a way that works for me, and how does it kind of overall create a diet and a food lifestyle that I feel excited about and is going to be sustainable.
I love it. Where should people go to find your work, the Humane League, and what's sort of one big takeaway you can leave us with?
Yeah, they can find us online at thehumaneleague.org, and we're on all the socials at the Humane League and various platforms. I think the biggest thing I would want people to take away is that you have more power than you realize, right, to influence institutional decision-making that can have a meaningful impact on farmed animals. And you can do that whatever your dietary choices are.
Yeah. Billions of farmed animals, by the way. Well, Dan Shannon, thanks so much for coming on. Keep up the good work. What you're doing is important, and we appreciate you taking the time, man.
Thank you for having me, Michael. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
That's a wrap. Thanks for checking out the show, and thanks to Dan for coming on. He's at thehumaneleague.org. Check them out. And if you're looking for ways to swap in some good protein that is plant-based, because that's one of the hardships of turning to plant-based products is getting in enough protein, check out Momentous Plant-Based Protein. It's fantastic. And also, tofu. A lot of people don't like tofu, but guess what? If you air fry tofu, it is amazing. I've turned so many people who were fundamentally anti-tofu onto tofu by telling them to put it in the air fryer, get it a nice sort of golden brown on the outside. God, it's fantastic. Please subscribe. That helps us. Please give us a review. That helps us as well. That way you'll get those updates for our twice weekly shows. And in closing, have fun, don't die, and be nice to animals.